Alright, this is the 10th video in my Stormlight Archive recap starting with The Way of Kings, and now I'm going to jump into Interludes 7, 8, and 9, and then Kaladin's POV of Part 4. So in Interlude 7, we have a character named Baxel, and he and his crew and their mistress, who leads them, are in Ashno of Sage's house. He's like the most richest, holiest man in Emule, and she's there destroying his art. We don't know why, but that's what she's doing. Then we also overhear a conversation between some of the characters talking about the Night Watcher, who we've heard mentions of is like this powerful old magic spren, and people go to her, to ask for a boon. And she may or may not give it to you, but then she, no matter what, also gives you a curse. For Interlude 8, we meet a character named Garanid, I think that's how you pronounce it. I have no idea. But she basically works on equations, while her partner, Ashnir, is a cook who always makes like questionable dishes, but sometimes they're good. And we learned from this one a little bit more about Spren, how she's looking at these flame Spren, and she notes that if you write down their measurements on a piece of paper, they'll like stop changing and they'll kind of freeze in whatever measurement you wrote down, but you can't make up measurements. They have to be accurate, and they're basically saying this could change stuff about the fabrials. And then to keep Zeth's chapter short and sweet, he's in Shallan's homeland and he kills the king of Yakaved. So we open up part 4 with a bridge run, and unfortunately, bridge 4 loses another member. Kaladin's distraught. He feels helpless, so he does what he knows how to do and starts healing people. And not just his own bridge crew. He starts, having his men collect the wounded from other bridges as well. They make the observation that Dalinar, his army is being seen with Sadius's, and people keep telling Kaladin that, Dalinar is like a true Light Eyes, like a man of honor, but Kaladin's been, stabbed in the back so many times, he just doesn't buy it. When we're on the next chasm duty, they start to devise a plan to smuggle spheres out of the chasm. Normally, this is not easy, including cavity searches, but they know they need this money, especially if they're going to be taking care of members of not just their own crew. So they end up devising a plan to stick the spheres to the bottom of the bridge. When they're in the chasm, they Rock ends up shooting an arrow with the sack of spheres to the bottom of the bridge, and then when they go on a run, they're going to retrieve it. They also discover that Shen, the Parshman who's now on their team, has a very adverse reaction to the men kicking, bumping into, or just disturbing the Parshendi bodies. And Kaladin kind of files that away. It's good to know. We have a scene where Lopin and Teft and Kaladin are hanging out, and Teft catches Kaladin off guard by throwing a punch at him, and then they watch and see Kaladin kind of breathe in the stormlight. And then Kaladin realizes he's been doing this, for a while. And he kind of confronts Syl because he's like, Syl, are you doing this to me? And she does admit that it is something, not just she's doing, but they have a connection. Something is happening between them. And then Kaladin thinks he's cursed because, the Radiants are not favored by society, or they think the Almighty. So he's like, well, if I'm replicating what the Radiants did, maybe that's why I'm cursed and all these people around me always die. Kaladin ends up going on a walk to clear his mind, and he runs into Hoid playing the flute. And long story short, Hoid in his way tells Kaladin a story, and what he gets out of it, Hoid asks Kaladin, so what is it that you don't want to take responsibility for? And, Kaladin has to think on that. And we also learn that Sigzil is Hoid's apprentice, and that's how he is a world singer. And then he also gives Hoid gives Kaladin his flute, and Kaladin's kind of like, what am I supposed to do with this? But he tells Kaladin that, learn how to play it by the next time I see you. By now, Kaladin realizes that he's not cursed, and Syl tells him, if he wants her to, she can break this connection. But if she does, she's going to go back to being a mindless spren, and he's going to lose his abilities. And he thinks to himself, this thing he has been using it to keep himself, and he could potentially use it to keep other people alive. So he doesn't want to take it away. Kaladin walks up to Teft because Teft has been making these little comments here and there, and he asks him, what do you know? And Teft says, not much, but he knows Kaladin's not a Radiant yet. There's the first ideal that we already heard, and then there are 4 more after that, and they're all different depending on the order, like the Knights Radiant order that you're in. Hashal, that bitchy wife that does not like the Bridgemen, comes back around and she says, you guys are just doing so great on these bridge runs. How about you do every single one? And they're like, great, she wants to kill us. She wants us to be dead. And so Kaladin starts devising this plan when he thinks back to, Shen's reaction to them messing with the Parshendi bodies. And then we also see Kaladin kind of learning what he can do with his ability. He learns to infuse things, starting with like putting his power into a stone and having that stone stick to the wall of the chasm. Kaladin also does a trust fall for Syl where he drops like 40 feet and he does survive. So he's learning more about what he can survive and what he can do. So right before the next bridge run starts, Kaladin gives Lopin, a bag to give back to him when they reach their final assault. And it turns out that this is armor that Kaladin made, basically just ropes tied to pieces of Parshendi like carapace and bones. And he puts that on right when they're about to do the final assault, and pretty much like you just see all the Parshendi or like most of the archers looking at Kaladin and focusing the arrow fire specifically on Kaladin. So that's basically what he wanted. He runs in front of his bridge and he's using his own stormlight to dodge the arrows and also like pull the arrows around him so he's not hit. He directs them into his shield so that his own bridgemen aren't hit. So it ends up being a success. After the fighting, Sadius comes around and Matal ends up taking credit for what Kaladin did. This time it's actually a good thing though. He gets a promotion. But then when Sadius goes away, he's like upset with Kaladin. But what Kaladin takes away from this is that he's going to be doing this every single time now. And if they're going to let his men be armored, then they're going to do it. And then right before the chapter ends, the Parshendi, which they don't normally do, break through the soldiers' line and like beeline it for Kaladin and his crew. But thankfully, before they can get reached, Dalinar shows up in his shard plate and destroys them. And then he raises his sword like in respect to Kaladin. And at this point, you can see Kaladin starting to like come around to Dalinar a little bit. One of Bridgefour's men apparently used to be like an armor maker, so he's making sets for the rest of Bridge 4. Kaladin continues training up his men. Moash and Scar seem to be the most skilled. They do 6 more bridge runs, and they pretty much perfected their, Parshendi armor runs. At this point, they have had no casualties over the past 6, so it is working very well. Then comes the assault on the tower. Now, this is a plateau that normally the Alethi lose against the Parshendi, but with Dalinar and Sadius fighting together, they seem to be being more successful. And I will talk more about this in Dalinar's POVs of Part 4, but from Kaladin's perspective, he sees the fighting, it's going well until it's not. And he notices that Sadius is pulling out his men, and he clocks it immediately that Sadius's forces are leaving Dalinar's forces to die. We get like a supervillain moment where Sadius crosses over Kaladin's bridge and he hears him say, "I told you, old friend, I said that honor of yours would get you killed one day." So Sadius and all of the bridge men are leaving. Kaladin's bridge kind of falls behind and they're the last bridge crew, and they look around and they realize like, wait, this is it. Like, we can make our escape. They're behind everybody. They can just run off. And they're going to, but then they look and see Dalinar is just fighting his heart out with his men, and they all look at each other and they're like, we can't leave them. And so they make the decision to take their bridge and go back to the plateau to help Dalinar's forces. Kaladin's using like all of his arrow or all of his stormlight to keep the arrows away from his men. They try the side carry of the bridge, but it's getting dire. Kaladin is spent. There's not much more he can do. Kaladin kind of loses consciousness a little bit, and he has the memory of when Tien died. And then when he wakes up, he hears a voice saying, "Do you know the words?" And he like pulls himself up on his feet, grabs a spear, and he realizes he can suck in the stormlight from the Parshendi. Like, they wear little gems in their beards and on their armor. And then he does say the second ideal. He says, "I will protect those who cannot protect themselves," and he explodes with light. Bridge 4 is just watching him with awe. He's fighting like a god, and they know that something big just happened, and they also arm themselves and go to support him. Adolin's soldiers make it to Kaladin, and Kaladin kind of uses his like soldier voice to command them, like, get the hell over that bridge and start getting men to safety. The Cobalt Guard will not leave without Adolin, so Kaladin fights his way to Adolin, and he's like, your men are going to die if you don't call them back. You get your men back, and I will go to Dalinar, because they see Dalinar's in trouble. I'll finish the rest of Kaladin's POV in the next video.